All right, I'm under another heat dome, so it's like 97 here today and probably about 56% humidity. But I've been inspired and also well motivated by the results of my recent physical that says it's probably a good thing I should do some sweating, even though I don't really feel like it. But what about that inspiration? Just a Bug, and if you haven't checked out his channel, please do. He has some really awesome content. I really love what he's doing. Did a recent video on a swordsmanship concept that he referred to as splaying. Now, I've never heard the term splaying before, which is kind of awesome because it gives me a word for something I really didn't have a word for before, or at least a new word for it. The basic concept, especially as it relates to two-handed swordsmanship, and he practices both Japanese and Korean swordsmanship, is what I've described in other videos. What happens when you don't maintain edge alignment? And this is going to be most common in those cuts that tend to, shall we say, contort, tie up, entangle your hands, where things get uncomfortable at the end of the cut. So I'm very specifically going to focus on 3 major cutting angles today as I look at this concept. Well, you've already seen one of them, the rising cut from left to right, which is probably the hardest one. But I'm also going to look at the horizontal and the diagonal downward cut in that. Basically, going from left to right is where my hands, well, they twist up and I don't feel like I can maintain a good grip. Now, what he calls splaying is what happens if you prematurely abandon your edge alignment because basically things have gotten too awkward or you're just not paying attention. So basically, instead of going like this, you start turning the sword to come back in the other direction, and what you wind up doing is about where you're about to hit the target, your blade's not aiming for it anymore. That's problematic. However, he very effectively demonstrates that you can start that turn, if that's what you want to do, basically right after you clear the target. It's kind of what I've seen similarly in a golf swing or baseball. Neither sports I'm any good at, but trying to learn them, I kind of got the concept of where you need to maintain edge alignment or club alignment or bat alignment, grip alignment to make a good swing versus where you can kind of let it, unwind. So I want to get into that. I want to look at it with a sword. I also want to look at it with sticks because there are arguably some differences with weapons that you don't have to maintain edge alignment for, or maybe you do. But I also want to connect this to a previous video I did on my blade return path. So I'm going to demonstrate some potential solutions for this problem based on those 3 different return paths that I described in that video. So let's get into it. All right, before we get started, caveats as always. I don't consider myself any kind of master expert, anything like that. I've just been doing this for a while, studying a lot of martial arts, and as I've said many times, kind of combining them, hybridizing them into what works for me, for what's important to me, which is, pragmatic application for me. Which gets me to caveat 2. I never intend to contradict anything that you are being taught, studying, practicing. If I can add something useful, or maybe you just like the way I explain stuff, fantastic. Also, this has nothing to do with any traditional Koryu, traditional martial arts teachings. Again, this is just the way I do things. But let's talk about when edge alignment isn't supposedly important. So we'll start with a stick. This is one of my waxwood eskrima sticks. Haven't seen this one before. And I'm going to start with a one-handed one that's kind of short so I can show it to you without hopefully hitting anything. But the argument is with a stick, whether it's a longer one or a shorter one, you don't have to worry about edge alignment. Now, I don't know if you're really going to see it. I'll go slow. That I can turn it freely as I swing. Theoretically. Now, theoretically, because in my practice, I don't let that happen because I don't feel it's effective for me for chaining power and momentum, or maybe I've just spent too much time with a sword. In order for me to get good power out of one of these, I maintain edge alignment in the strikes. So is that limiting? Could be. I mean, I certainly can do movements in a pinch that allow me to use other surfaces of the stick. But if I'm going for power and focus, yeah, I'm going to basically treat it as if it had a primary edge. So when you see me strike, it's going to be very much with, I can maneuver it with circling, but I'm definitely going to focus on hitting with what would be that edge in any direction. Okay? So I do see the benefit, even with a blunt weapon, of maintaining edge alignment through the strike, or at least through what it is you're going to hit. And then after it's cleared, yeah, I'll change the way it's facing. How does this apply to a two-handed sword? Alright, the star of today's steamy presentation is Seigi, my antique Shingunto, well, one of them. The reason why I'm using Seigi today is because Seigi is a little bit shorter, gives me a little bit more room to move in this confined space, but especially because the sori is a lot deeper than many of my other Japanese-style swords, so hopefully that allows you to see edge alignment a little bit better. Now, defining splaying, at least according to Just a Bug, the way he describes it is it's what happens when, again, in those cuts which tend to be, for a right-handed swordsman, the left to right ones. Your wrists are getting tangled up, your hands are getting tangled up, you don't feel like you can keep a grip on the blade. So you naturally unwind your hands. That's what he calls splaying. If you do this prematurely, yeah, you're going to hit the target with the flat of your blade, which is either going to be ineffective or, in worst case, could bend your blade. Yeah, not something you ever want to really do. Again, there are always exceptions to every rule, but in general, I would not want to do that with one of my swords. But a couple of solutions that I've kind of already presented, one of which is if you're cutting in that direction, sometimes just switching feet, putting the left foot forward, stepping in with the left foot, can take some of the tension off of that, which is probably why you see it so frequently in kata, that you step with that cut when you cut in that direction. My other simple solution to it, based on my own practice, this is because I practice almost equally with a sword, including a Japanese-style sword, in two hands and in one hand, that I feel like if the angle that I'm moving in, and I want to move quickly and smoothly, fluidly, might be better served by transitioning to one hand, I'll do that. And I'm just really used to finding my hilt again with my left hand. That's just something I'm good at. I've gotten used to it over the years. It might not be something that's natural or easy for you. It might not be part of what you're being taught, learning, practicing. So again, this is my solution to the problem that I use. Well, not all the time, but sometimes. So we'll keep it on the table. However, one of the things that Just a Bug got criticized for, and it's probably from certain traditionalists or people that practice a lot of tamashigiri, this is what they've been taught, and this reflects back to my video on blade return paths. And their rule is you never turn the blade. Basically, when you cut, you keep edge alignment at all times and return the blade from the spine in the same angle. And we've talked about that in that other video. Now, my advice to you is definitely practice this, because it is excellent, as I brought up in that blade return path video, at practicing good cutting mechanics, good edge alignment, especially if you're making repeated cuts. Don't neglect this technique. However, I'm at a stage where I will use it tactically, as I mentioned in the other video, if it makes sense to me to move my blade that way for whatever the next thing is I'm going to do. So for instance, cut, 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 right? Cut, cut. So it makes sense based on what my plan is for the next movement to return from the spine. We also talked a little bit on how you might be able to hook with the back of your tip, hit with the mune, but I'm not going to get into that so much today. So for me, that's where I'll use that. Or just sometimes when I'm doing straight up cutting practice and I want good clean edge alignment because it's a pretty tough target. Or I'm not sure of the blade or something like that. But what are the other options? Again, revisiting that video I did on different blade return paths. All right, it's hot. I'm having trouble concentrating, but let me insert something that should have been in the last section that actually kind of makes sense right here. And I talked about this a lot in my blade return paths and also cutting stroke length, the video, that I will use this straight return from the spine, especially if I'm using a shorter cutting stroke, pretty much every time. Why? Because I'm not really going through the target, so I can't turn it here very well, effectively, or safely. I'm going to have to bring it back the way it came. But anytime I'm cutting through, that's where I'll get some options. Now, option one, based on my next blade return path, is again making sure, training for this, and the way you get used to it is by practicing that straight repetitive cut. But hopefully you get to a point where you feel like you can keep your blade straight through the cutting path and then use the circular return to move into a different cut, okay? And do something like that. So basically, I am still focusing through the cut, keeping my edge alignment, but once I'm through, I can then move the blade into another path. But again, that takes a lot of training and practice to make sure you're not doing that prematurely. That's going to make a mess. All right, so there's that solution. What's the next solution? Okay, revisiting that criticism that Just a Bug got about never turn the blade, return it from the spine. You'll notice that depending on the style that you're practicing, there may be kata or combinations where you don't, that you use one of these other returns I'm showing you. You cut from another angle on the next action, move the sword into another position after the cut, but yes, you're probably training very, very diligently to maintain that edge alignment through the cut. That's why they really focus on that in training so much. But another thing that Just a Bug pointed out is sometimes if you're used to that quick return from the spine, it actually feels, especially with this bind, very natural to come back the way you went, right? It actually feels pretty good, pretty quick, pretty natural, not too much hesitation. So he talks about how it feels like there may be some hesitation if you're waiting until very late in the cut, well, pretty much at the end, to turn your hands and then come in another direction. Feels like it might be interrupting your momentum. So that's something to practice and get used to. Now, I don't tend to notice it much in the circular returns, but again, most of my focus is on maintaining my cutting angle, and then I almost get to relax at the end of the cut. So you can think of it like that. Now, this is very interesting when we talk about the third blade return path, which I find the most tactically devastating, and it's one that we'll cover in a lot of other videos. And that is returning the cut basically by turning the edge back and sending it back the way it came, edge first. And that can be done in any of a number of combinations, but specifically these ones that bind, okay? Cutting diagonally upwards, downwards, or doing the downward and going back to the diagonally up, or this way, right? Can it be done horizontally? Absolutely. So any of those cuts we've just talked about. I've actually found that the directions, the left to right directions, that bind up my hands the most allow me to reverse and go back the other way faster, just a little bit, and maybe even with a little bit more power. It's almost like I've stored up and coiled this energy. And that by unwinding the hands and coming back, I feel like I can really return that second cut very quickly. Plus the second cut is going in that direction that doesn't bind me, right? So that's another bonus. So sometimes the bind can help. But again, practice the edge alignment and then worry about the transition. Develop that later. Take your time. This is a lifetime practice. Now let's talk about, well, your hands. All right, depending on the style of Japanese swordsmanship that you're studying, you may have heard a term that translates roughly to wringing the tea cloth. And the idea is to kind of tension the hands inward, kind of counter pressure in towards each other, to tighten your grip, secure your edge alignment, and it also helps you control the sword in the cut, especially stopping the cut. So this is kind of an exaggerated version of it, but yeah, just a little bit of inward tension when your sword is being used in a power cut in any direction. Now, any direction? All right, this is hardest for me when there's a bind. For instance, conversely, in sword guard postures, which I'll cover in other videos, where my sword is cross-body, left foot forward, it's on the right side of my body, with the blade forward, or maybe it's facing backwards like this, with my right foot forward. You'll see this also somewhat in European longsword. There is certainly a precedent for relaxing the grip of your left hand, your power hand, especially your power fingers, your lower fingers. They could completely release from the sword or just kind of lightly contact it. Most of my grip, my control of the blade, my second hand, if there's any at all, is the web of the hand, which in Japanese style swordsmanship is usually not a thing you do, and certainly not a thing you do when you're cutting. So when you're cutting, you don't want to do that. If you're in more of a relaxed guard position, yeah, that might make a little bit more sense, but obviously before you move into anything with power, you're going to shift your grip back, right? Now, I've already talked about a couple of compensation techniques to allow you to maintain that good two-handed grip in the cut, but you're going to have to practice and see what works for you. And range of motion and other limitations. I certainly have arthritic damaged hands. Yeah, I have to take that into account. May or may not get in your way. But what I've found is not only moving the left foot forward, but also just using my entire body, turning hips and shoulders into the cut, can help me overcome that tension problem that could tempt me to splay, to turn the sword early to unwind my hands, or not be able to maintain the straight cut, or not be able to keep that left hand on there strong enough to give me that good power, right? Now, my most problematic cut personally for this is, well, the one I just showed you, the rising one from left to right. And the way I've learned to overcome it is almost kind of backwards. I start from tension. So when I launch that cut, I'll launch it from basically here where my hands are already contorted. They're already bound, right? The idea is my left hand is pretty much, my wrist is bent to pretty much the extent of its range of motion. I'm struggling to keep my lower fingers on there, but that's actually increasing the tension of my lower fingers if I can manage it. But when I do the cut, yeah, I'm going to use those changes in, body mechanics that I talked about in other videos, like my leaning forward video. You see I'm starting to lean. I'm starting to turn myself with this cut. I'm actually getting my whole body kind of behind it. So leg, hip, shoulder, waist, everything. I'm still keeping my right foot forward, for instance, in this cut, but I almost feel like I'm getting myself behind and even underneath this to cut upward. Now, freezing it here for a second, one thing you might be able to see is, even though this is very bound for me and very uncomfortable, this is actually less bound than it was when I started. So in a certain way, I feel like I'm uncoiling and taking advantage of that power, setting up with a good coil to cut upwards. Now, sometimes I might not feel like I can get that. For instance, if I cut through and then bring the sword back, but I'll try to get as much as possible. Get as much of me behind this blade. Really focus on that counter tension to wring the towel for me, as it were, to cut upwards. And again, this is my most difficult, challenging cut to get good power and edge alignment. I can do it really easy with one hand. That's not a problem whatsoever. And you'll notice I did actually manage to keep edge alignment and then relaxed at the end. Not a problem. But two hands, problem. I might feel a little bit of that in the horizontal, but I kind of use that same mechanic. Almost start with the tension, more tension than I'm going to have when I end it, and use my entire body rotating behind that cut. The diagonal downward is not quite so bad. I can usually solve that by just switching feet or turning my hips and shoulders a little bit more. That one's a bit easier, but your mileage may vary. So, speaking of, let's get our usual conversation going in the comments. What are you learning? What are you practicing? What works for you? Did any of this make sense? Was it useful? Again, those comments also inspire ideas for endless new videos, so keep it coming. But until next time, as always, well, stay cool if you're under a heat dome like I am. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back for more.